Rabbi Sai, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to look a bit more closely. Just to remind you, we started last week looking at the Tefilot of Rosh Hashanah. And as I mentioned before, Rosh Hashanah this year is going to be even a bit more demanding than usual because you have to largely generate your own ruach. You can't completely depend on the ruach, on the atmosphere generated in the community, because all community activities will either be non-existent or will be cut short. Although I must tell you, I heard you, Eli, speaking about cutting short the Tefillah of Rosh Hashanah. I'm not sure exactly what one can cut out. What are you going to cut out? Are you going to cut out Avinu Malkeinu? Are you going to cut out Unasanet Tokef? Are you going to cut out Malchus, Zichronos, and Schaefer? Are you going to cut out Chila Lokeil, Heya, and Pifios? What are you going to cut out? I wouldn't like to be the person who's charged with the duty of editing the Machzor of Rosh Hashanah, where every page has got so much content and so much meaning to it. But I do understand that under the corona emergency situations, we do need to do something. One thing I have been told, actually, probably, I don't know which communities are going to adopt this or not, is with regards to the Schaefer. That the Schaefer is not my topic today, but please God, in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to be dedicating the Shia to the Schaefer. But I have been told that whereas normally every Rosh Hashanah we listen to 100 kolos, 100 sounds of Schaefer, in actual fact, if you go back to the original sources of those 100 kolos, only 60 of them are required halachically, and the last 40 are a minhag. And therefore, in times of stress, in times of difficulty, we cut out the last 40. And therefore, possibly many shuls that I know of are talking about just blowing the 30 kolos before Shemona Esra, which are called the Schaefer, the yeshiva, and the other 30 kolos during the Chazaras Hashatz of Musaf, and that's it, and not to do the last 40 at all. And that is completely in keeping with the original halacha. But the minhag is always to do 100 kolos, so maybe some shuls will still do 100, but that will certainly cut down. That's really, I think, an example of what can be done on Rosh Hashanah, is to differentiate between different levels of requirement, if you like, in terms of the Rosh Hashanah service. And we'll see. I also have no idea yet where I'm going to be davening and how it's going to work. We're all actually in difficult times because of the Magaifa, because of the virus, and something very much to daven for on Rosh Hashanah. When we daven on Rosh Hashanah, Zachreinu L'chaim, we need to have in mind all the people whose lives are threatened by this plague, and that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should protect us. And we'll speak more about that as we go along. Okay, let's start off with actually a topic that I touched on last week. Last week I touched on the 2 or 3 central themes of the Rosh Hashanah Tefillah. Just to remind you, we spoke about the universality of Rosh Hashanah. That Rosh Hashanah is actually a day where we stand before HaKadosh Baruch Hu not only as members of Am Yisrael, but also as members of mankind. And we're davening for the well-being of mankind. That the judgment on Rosh Hashanah is for Kol Bo'ei Olam, as the Mishnah says. So that's something we touched on last week, and I'll be coming back to that shortly. But I'd like to first learn with you a few psukim out of the Tanakh, which deal with a very interesting event that took place 2,500 years ago. We're going to get a glimpse of Rosh Hashanah 2,500 years ago. Just to give you a little bit of background before you look at the text itself. So 2,500 years ago, Klal Yisrael were led by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah, right, in the Tanakh that you have on your shelf, there are actually 2 books called Ezra and Nehemiah, even though really they're all one book. Chazal only counted it as one book, the Ezra and Nehemiah book. Ezra and Nehemiah worked as a team, right? Where, in a sense, Ezra was the Av Bezdin, Ezra was the Poisek and the Godel Hadar, and Nehemiah was the, if you like, chief rabbi, was the political and social leader of the generation. And together, what they pulled off was something which is very relevant to us in our century, which is they pulled off Shivat Zion. They pulled off bringing Klal Yisrael back into the land of Israel and rebuilding Eretz Yisrael after the Golus. In fact, it's probably in the whole of the Tanakh the closest model we have of what has happened to us returning to the land of Israel and building Medinat Yisrael. I'm quite sure that Ezra and Nehemiah had a lot of hana in the last 100 of years, watching what's happening in the land of Israel, and how Jewish life has been reestablished here. But let's have a look at a chapter together. I'm going to learn with you a few psukim out of a chapter in Nehemiah, chapter 8. And let's see if I can do the screen share. Hold on a second. The host needs to give me permission to do screen sharing. I don't know if you know how to do that. Yes, Ali, have you taken postgraduate training in Zoom technology that allows you to allow me? Oh, good, excellent, thank you very much. Right, just 1 second. Okay. Good. Can you see a text? Yes, you can see a text. Elian is always quick to help me on this. Thank you, Elian. Okay, so you can see the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. And whenever I bring a source, I encourage everybody, whenever possible, to make a note or maybe look at it afterwards. Open your Tanakh. You don't often open your Tanakh and learn the book of Nehemiah, but this is an opportunity to do so. So as I say, just to remind you, what's happened is Ezra and Nehemiah have brought just about more than 40,000 people back to Eretz Yisrael, and they are re-establishing Jewish presence in Israel, maybe not yet Jewish sovereignty. For the first 200 years of Bais Sheni, the Jewish people were not sovereign in the land. They were living by kind permission of the Persian Empire. But they were certainly resident, and they were independent, and they could rebuild Yerushalayim and rebuild the Beis HaMikdash. So Ezra and Nehemiah came back. Let's have a look at a few psukim together. I'm going to read the Hebrew, but you can follow in the English if you like. Vayeshvu hakohanim v'halavim v'hashoyarim v'hamashoyarim umin ha'om v'hanasinim. So he's giving a bit of a list of all the different categories. Ezra and Nehemiah were very conscious of different, if you like, strata of society, that each one of them needed to be, if you like, addressed separately and dealt with separately. So was the Kohanim and the Leviim. And it's interesting, there is the Hashoarim v'hamashoyarim. That within the Leviim, there were two different groups. The Shoyarim means literally the gatekeepers, from the word Sha'ar, and the Mashoyarim are the singers. And these were the two primary obligations of Leviim in general, was to provide the music and to provide the administration and look after the people who are coming in and out, the Sha'arim, the gatekeepers. Umin ha'om v'hanasinim, I'm not going to go into the Nasinim for the moment, v'chol Yisrael ba'oreihem. And the Jewish people who had come back to the land of Israel had settled down in villages all over the place. And what happened? Vayiga ha'chodesh hashvi. It was the beginning of the 7th month. And I put in brackets here, Tishrei. Right? So the 7th month, it's the beginning of the 7th month, Ubnei Yisrael v'oreya. And what was going to happen was, they were all going to be in their own little villages on the 7th month. But Ezra had a different plan. What was his plan? Vayosvu kol ha'om ki'ish echad el ha'rochov asher lifnei sha'ar hamayim. He made a national assembly. He brought everyone together. Exactly how one brings, I don't know, must have been 100,000 people together, all in one meeting in earlier times, maybe a whole field. Harachov asher lifnei sha'ar hamayim, exactly the water gate, whatever that refers to. Vayomer le'Ezra HaSofer lahavia Sefer Torahs Moshe asher tzivu Hashem es Yisrael. And the people said to Ezra, what we need to do today, it's Rosh Hashanah today, right? The beginning of Tishri. What we need to do is to learn Torah. And one of the interesting things about this chapter 8 is that it seems from this chapter that this particular Rosh Hashanah, they didn't really spend the day davening, they spent the day learning. Maybe this is an idea for some communities, Eli. If you, that on Rosh Hashanah, one should do a little bit maybe of each, not just davening, but some learning Torah as well. But here's an occasion where you'll see that the entire day they spend learning Torah. But the reason for that here is that a lot of them had forgotten large parts of the Torah. Don't forget, they'd gone through very difficult times in exile, the first time that the Jews were in the diaspora, and then they had to fight for their existence. Don't forget, there's no printed books, it's all manuscripts. And all they and they had to travel, make the trip back from Bavel to the land of Israel and build houses and plow the lands and build the walls of Jerusalem. They'd been extremely busy. They hadn't had much time for learning. So this Rosh Hashanah turned out to be a day to bring Torahs Moshe. Interesting how how the Torah here is described as Torahs Moshe, right? Also in the end of Malachi, he says, Zichru Torahs Moshe, right? Torahs Moshe, the Chumash, Asher Tziv Hashem is Yisrael. Let's learn Torah together. What happened? By Yovi Ezra HaKohen es HaTorah Lifnei HaKol. And Ezra brings the Torah out to the people. Lifnei HaKol, the Kol, right, is the community, right, the whole community. And interesting, Me'ish Va'ad Isha. If you ever need a source in Tanakh to as the foundation of adult education for men and for women equally in terms of Talmud Torah, here it is. Ezra HaSofer decided that today Rosh Hashanah was going to be a Yom Limud. It was going to be a day of learning for every man and woman, right? V'chol mevin lishmoa. Also a very interesting phrase this. V'chol mevin lishmoa. All who could listen with understanding. Listen with understanding. The Chazal say that what he did was he read the Torah, and then he also read for each pasuk the Targum, right? The laning of the Torah plus the Targum was very common in earlier times. It meant, of course, that laning took much longer. Every pasuk was laned, and the Targum, of course, was the spoken language of people in Bavel, the Aramaic. So the Torah with the Aramaic translation, Chol Mevin Lishmoa, and all who could listen with understanding. And when is this all taking place? B'yom echad lachodesh hashvi, on Rosh Hashanah. So Rosh Hashanah becomes a national revival of Talmud Torah. And what did he do? Vayikro bo lifnei harachov, asher lifnei sharamayim. And this learning, Torah, went on min ha'or ad machatzis hayom, from daybreak until midday. So I think that's quite a lengthy, what do you think, ladies and gentlemen? Quite a lengthy learning session, right? From daybreak until midday, they were learning Torah with Ezra HaSefer. Ezra and Nehemiah, I've actually edited out quite a few psukim in order to get the general meaning of this chapter, but the psukim also list about a dozen different teachers. In other words, it wasn't just one man teaching everybody. They divided up into different groups, and each teacher taught different groups at different levels to explain what the Torah was about. Right? And the whole focus of the day was listening to Sefer Torah. Vayiftach Ezra HaSefer le'enei kol ha'am. This, incidentally, this phrase here, this pasuk in Nehemiah, is the origin of our minhag to do Hagbah. The mitzvah of Hagbah, of lifting up the Sefer Torah, comes from this pasuk in Nehemiah chapter 8, Yiftach Ezra HaSofer La'einei, he opened up the Sefer Torah in front of all the people, right? And so actually, I must tell you, according to the simple pshat in these psukim, it seems that he did Hagbah before the beginning of laning, not at the end of laning. A bit like the Minhag Sfarad, if I'm not mistaken. In the world of in the Sephardi minhag is to do Hagbah before you start laning. Am I right? You've seen some. You've probably seen some minhagim of that nature, and that comes from here, right? Ukapitcho, and when he Ukapitcho means and when he opened the Sefer Torah and did Hagbah, Omdu Kol Ha'om, everybody stood up. In other words, this wasn't just a moment of Limud Torah, it was also meant to be a moment of Kovod HaTorah. In other words, it was a moment of showing our dedication and our respect for the Sefer Torah itself. And I say, this is the origin of a lot of what we do in Shul today. The whole idea of taking out the Sefer Torah and saying, Hallo Hashem Hashem, Kniskav Shemo Levadei, and making a production out of bringing the Sefer Torah out and us welcoming it and standing up for it. All this is the comes from Ezra HaSofer. The whole idea of standing up when a Sefer Torah comes into the room. You stand up. I remember some of you might have been there when Rabbi Sachs retired as chief rabbi of the UK. There was a big dinner made for him in Park Lane. And mostly Jewish people, but also quite a few non-Jews were there, politicians and professors and academics and admirers, including Prince Charles. And there must have been about 500-600 people sitting there. It was a very impressive evening. And there were a couple of tables of Rabbonim where I was sitting. And at the end of the whole event, so the president of the United Synagogue said, and now we'd like to present the chief rabbi with a gift. And it seems like he didn't know what he was going to get. And what happened was somebody came in holding a Sefer Torah. They were going to present him with a Sefer Torah, right? So you can imagine the scenario. Everyone's sitting down after a long meal and a long evening and hundreds of people. And in walks one of the Gaboim holding a Sefer Torah. And instinctively, all the Yidden in the hall stood up. Everybody stood up. And I saw the non-Jewish people there were looking around. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know what had happened. Why are we standing up? They had no idea why everybody was standing up. They were a bit bewildered by this. But it was just an instinctive reaction on behalf of even lots of the non-frum people there in the hall. Lots of the non-observant, let's put it that way, non-observant people in the hall, but they know when a Sefer Torah comes into the room, you stand up, and one of the very few occasions that I saw Rabbi Sachs lost for words. He's not. I've never in my life actually seen him lost for words. He's one of the world experts in finding the right word for the right moment, but he was completely overwhelmed by this gift. Anyhow, so the origin of standing up comes here by Omdu Kol Ha'om. Ezra HaSofer lifted up the Sefer Torah. Everybody stood up and gave Kovod HaTorah. Okay. So what happens is Vayivorech Ezra Hashem Elokim HaGadol. So this also is a reference to what we call Birkas HaTorah, right? That he said Asher Bochabon Mikol Ha'amim, and everybody says Amen. Okay, so in other words, these are what we do at Kriyas HaTorah. Right? If you want to ever look back at the sources, where do we know what to do in Shul with Kriyas HaTorah and how to behave before, during, and after? It's this chapter, Nehemiah chapter 8. Vayikru b'Sefer Torah Elokim, and they read from the scroll of the teaching of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Meforosh. So Meforosh means translating it. The Som Seichel. Som Seichel means explaining it. It was about 1,500 years before Rashi, you understand, so there was no Rashi, but the equivalent the equivalent of Rashi in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. He explained to them the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Basically, Torah Sheba'al Peh, even though it hadn't been written down yet, existed. Ba'al Peh was known Ba'al Peh, but how many people knew it? Ba'al Peh. How many people knew it? Only really the inner circle of Talmidei Chachamim, but the general community didn't know it. So this was a major event of learning Torah and Torah Shebechsav, Torah Shebeh, v'yovinu b'mikra, and they understood the reading. So this is what we do today. Kriyas HaTorah is simply a reading without any additional explanations. Is actually just a little bit of a poor reflection of what went on there on that Rosh Hashanah. But you understand that Rosh Hashanah was a moment of, if you like, renewing the covenant. It was a moment of renewing the covenant of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And now comes an interesting thing. Vayoma Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, who hatirshata. Nehemiah was the tirshata. So the tirshata has got a very interesting double meaning. So apparently tirshata originates from a Persian word, which means sort of he was the governor, the representative of the emperor of the Jewish people. But Chazal say that this word was chosen in the Tanakh because it contains within it two different things, which is heter shasa. Shasa means to drink, and heter means to allow. In other words, Nehemiah had to participate with he sat at political events and he went to political meetings on behalf of the Jewish people, and he had to drink wine. And the wine was normally also for him to drink because it was a non-Jewish wine, right? But he had a special heter. Heter shasa means he was permitted because he was working on behalf of Klal Yisrael. It's a whole issue. Anyway, Nehemiah was the political leader of the time. That's Nehemiah. And Ezra is called HaKohen HaSofer. Schaefer here doesn't mean somebody who writes tefillin and mezuzahs. Schaefer means he knew every letter and every word of Torah Shebechsav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and he was a walking library of the entire Torah. Right. So what did they say to the people? Look at this. So this is a very interesting, it's because of this pasuk that I wanted to read with you this chapter. Because in this pasuk it captures the paradox of Rosh Hashanah. He learns with them about Rosh Hashanah. He teaches them that not only is it a day of the Schaefer, it's the day of the Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. They know that on a day of judgment, they haven't been living perfect lives, right? As we say repeatedly on Rosh Hashanah, Mi yamoid lefanecha badin, right? Who is able to confidently stand in judgment before HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be judged, right? Im avoino is tishma ya Hashem mi yamoid. Who is able to stand if HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks for all our shortcomings? Clearly not. So what happened here? So Ezra and Nehemiah say to the people, no, Hayom Kodesh Hu L'Hashem Elokeichem. Today is Yom Tov. It's a Yom Tov. Al tis'ablu. Al tis'ablu comes from the word avelus, right? Don't go into mourning. Don't mourn. V'al tivku. And don't cry. Why do they have to say that? So the Apostle says, Ki bochin ha'am, k'shamam es divrei Torah. The people started crying because they were learning Torah. They learned the mitzvahs of Kashrus and of Shabbos and of Nida and of Yom Kippur and of Pesach and Bris Milah. They were learning Torah, and they realized they hadn't been doing things properly well, and they realized it was a Yom Hadin, so they were sad. So Nehemiah and Ezra says to them, no, the message of Rosh Hashanah is, it's a Yom Tov. It's not a time for crying and weeping. And here's a beautiful pasuk, which should be written up in every Rosh Hashanah machzor. Some machzorim bring it actually in the introduction to all the tefillahs. This pasuk says, and he says to them, after he's had a whole morning, it's now midday, right? They've been learning Torah all morning. They got the message. And he says to them, no, ichlu mashmalim hashsudam takim. It's time to go home and have a yontef meal and celebrate. V'shilchu monos le'inoch. Interesting, shlach monos. We associate shlach monos with Purim. But actually, Ezra and Nehemiah said Mishlach Monos is for every Yontif. What does it mean, Mishlach Monos? Is to make sure that even the lesser fortunate people have a Suda, have a proper Yontif meal. That's one part of it. And the other part of it is to express friendship to your friends and colleagues, essentially Mishlach Monos. But look at how he says it. Ki Kodesh, sorry. Today is a day of sanctity. Don't be atzuv. Don't be sad. And here comes one of the most beautiful phrases of the whole chapter. Ki chedvat Hashem hi ma'uzchem. The beautiful languages. Those people are sensitive a bit to the poetry of Rosh HaKodesh. Chedvat Hashem. For rejoicing in Hashem, that is your strength. In other words, it's the simcha that's your strength. So today, Rosh Hashanah has to be a day of simcha, even though it's also a day of judgment, and therefore a day of anxiety to a certain extent. So Rosh Hashanah, and there's no place in the whole Tanakh which expresses this deep paradox of Rosh Hashanah better than Nehemiah chapter 8. Because here you find the people are being reconnected to Divrei Torah. They're getting a shir from the Gadol Hador on all the details of the Torah. And they're told today is Rosh Hashanah, it's a Yom Adin, it's a day of judgment. And then they tell them, no, it's not a time to be sad. You've got to know that you're judged. You've got to know you're accountable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it's a cause for simcha. And that combination is not so easy to understand. Because indeed, it's true, Rosh Hashanah is a time for sadness. In fact, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah deals with a very interesting question. The Gemara says, well, wait a minute, if Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are a Yomim Tovim, let's say Hallel. Why don't we say, the Gemara asks this question, why is there no Hallel Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? And the Gemara understands that really, in essence, it would be appropriate to say Hallel Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur because it's a Yontef. Chedvat Hashem hi ma'uzchem. It's a day for rejoicing. But the Gemara says, no, on the other hand, Sifrei HaChaim, Pesuchim Lefonov, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has in front of him the book of life, and we are all anxious about being inscribed in the Sefer HaChaim and to do tshuva, and therefore it's not really a full simcha. So this combination is at the heart of Rosh Hashanah. That there are both halves to the day. And therefore, in our davening as well, we find expressions of great joy and celebration. And at the same time, we find expressions of trepidation and fear. And that is expressed here in, and the Levim went around giving the message to everybody. Hasuk Yayom Kodesh Al Teotzfu. They went around telling everybody, now's not time to be sad. It's time to understand Judaism and Torah and Halacha afresh, to renew your covenant with God, and to celebrate. There's no greater source of celebration. And then the chapter ends with this pasuk that they went home, right? This is the end of the chapter. They went home and had a yontif. Because they understood what they'd been taught. Okay, so this is part of the source for some communities having a custom to make a kiddush before Schaefer on Rosh Hashanah morning. Some communities do this. For many communities, it's simply logistically not possible to do. But the reason to do that is to express this idea that even though that we shouldn't really it shouldn't be a fast, shouldn't be a day of fasting. It should be a day of celebrating. But getting that balance right, that is really the challenge of Rosh Hashanah. And this, Nehemiah chapter 8, and in fact, in Hilchos Rosh Hashanah, the Mishnah Brura brings down this pasuk. Mishnah Brura says to them, the Mishnah Brura mentions this pasuk, Ki chedvas Hashem hi ma'uzchem. Right? This is the punchline of the whole chapter. Right? And he says, no, it's time to celebrate. It's time to take the Torah seriously. Realize you're being judged, and that should be a cause of celebration. Okay, Rabbi Sai. So far, so good. That was just my if you like, a very interesting, but I think quite important source of getting a snapshot of what Rosh Hashanah was like 2,500 years ago. And now I'd like to look at. Okay, there are different themes. Let's now focus a bit more directly on the machzah and on our davening for Rosh Hashanah, because that's my goal in these shiurim, to bring the machzah a bit more to life. And generally, if you're able to get hold of a machzah with commentaries and with explanations, etc., it might be a good idea in the couple of weeks before Rosh Hashanah, spend a bit of time looking at it. There are certain recurring themes. So last week, we looked at Zachreinu L'chaim, which is the idea of the judgment. And we looked at V'chein Tein Pachtacha, right? What I want to look at today is Hamelech HaKodesh, because the word Hamelech is probably, if we had to single out one word, which was the linchpin of the whole of Rosh Hashanah davening, it must be Hamelech. Right? Hamelech comes again and again, every single part of our tefillos. And why is it important, and what does it actually mean? What do we mean when we speak about Hamelech? Okay, so we'll come to that. I wanted to show you also that I mentioned to you last week one of the interesting, if you like, question marks in understanding Rosh Hashanah properly is that the Chumash itself tells us about Rosh Hashanah only one thing, that it's Yom Teruah. The Chumash itself only tells us that it's a day of blowing the Schaefer. Right? It doesn't actually say in the Chumash that it is a day of judgment. Right? The idea of the Yom Hadin, which is the central theme of all our davening, is based on Torah Shebaal Peh. Right? For people who don't know Torah Shebaal Peh, or in earlier times people didn't accept Torah Shebaal Peh, they had no idea that Rosh Hashanah was any day other than a day when you blew the Schaefer and that's it. But what was the significance of the Schaefer, and how are we supposed to understand it, and what was its meaning for us? You have no idea at all without the Torah Shebaal Peh. Just as a footnote here, it's important to emphasize this, not everyone's aware of this completely, that the Chumash by itself, without the Mishnah and the Gemara, is not just incomplete, but it's inconceivable and it's incomprehensible. In other words, there are lots and lots of things in the Chumash which, unless we have the Mishnah and the Gemara, we simply have no idea what it is. Right? For example, the Chumash says in the Kriyat Shema, you should put it on your arm and put it on your head. But what the it is, what we call tefillin, is it black? Is it blue? Is it square? Is it round? What's written on it? How's it supposed to work? How are you supposed to tie it on? The Torah doesn't, the Chumash doesn't say anything about that at all. All that is in the Torah Shebaal Peh. Similarly, on Shabbos, it just says, Lo tasu kol malacha, you shouldn't do any work. But how you're supposed to keep Shabbos, what is work, what isn't work? There's no way you can know from the Chumash how to keep Shabbos. There's no way you can know from the Chumash how to keep Pesach, how to put on tefillin. There's no way you can know from the Chumash what are tzitzis and what is a lulav and what is a Schaefer. There's no way you can know. It's only in Torah Shebaal Peh. It's only with the Mishnah and the Gemara, the oral tradition, that we understand how to do mitzvahs. Many people often make a mistake about that and think, well, we can keep the Chumash. The Chumash by itself is an incomprehensible text for anybody who wants to follow the mitzvahs, unless you have the commentary of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Anyhow, so here we've got, so here we have an example of that Rosh Hashanah itself is incomprehensible without the Mishnah. But there is one place in the Tanakh which gives us a remez, gives us an indication. And interestingly enough, that's in Tehillim. So I'd like to read with you a couple of psukim from Tehillim, which should be familiar to many people, because it is the Hayom Yom Chamishi B'Shabbos. It is a mizmor that we say once a week in Shacharis on a Thursday morning, Tehillim 81, right? Which starts with the words L'Natzeach ala Gittis La'asaf. Exactly what is a Gittis and who was Asaf is not my subject for today. But what's interesting is that in this Tehillim, it says something very interesting. This pasuk, Chazal were very interested in this pasuk and analyze it in the Gemara very carefully. What does it mean? Tik'u b'chodesh shofar b'kesa liyom chagenu. These 6 words are a bit of a contain a coded message. So the word chodesh means Rosh Chodesh. And Tik'u b'chodesh shofar is when you blow the shofar on Rosh Chodesh. So there's only one place in the Torah which tells us about blowing the shofar on Rosh Chodesh, and that is Rosh Hashanah. Because, of course, whatever else Rosh Hashanah is, it's also Rosh Chodesh, right? It's the first day of the month of Tishri. And it's Ba'keseh. Okay, so Keseh comes from the words Mechuseh, right? Okay, I can see that the English translation here, which incidentally is not my translation, I usually try and edit it a little bit. I must tell you, one of the most magnificent pieces of software for text nowadays is Safaria. And Safaria gives you wonderful range of text to get free of charge. You can use it, I think. But the English translation is not reliable. I don't know who did the English translation. And here's a good example. Look at this English translation. It's a complete error. Can you see that? Chazal understood the Tik'u b'chodesh shofar, that on the full moon of your feast day. It's not the full moon at all. The full moon is the 15th of the month, right? Blow the horn on the new moon, ba'keseh. So Chazal ba'keseh means when it is hidden. In other words, the new moon is hidden on Rosh Chodesh. On Rosh Chodesh itself, you can't see the new moon, right? Liyom chagenu, on the day of your chag. So this pasuk is a reference to Rosh Hashanah, because it's also a chag, it's also the Schaefer, and it's also Rosh Chodesh. We've got 3 clear indications about what is being referred to here in this mizmor. And then he goes on to say, Ki chok liYisrael hu mishpat leLokei Yaakov. That this is a day of mishpat, right? And again, the English translation doesn't do a good job here. It says here, a ruling of the God of Yaakov. That's not what it means here. It means a judgment. Mishpat here means a judgment. In Ivrit, mishpatim means rulings, means laws. But actually, in Lashon HaKodesh, mishpat here means a judgment of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch HaMelech HaMishpat, right? Is a God who sits in judgment. So the word here, I'm going to do Safaria a favor and adjust the English translation here right on the spot. That Mishpat leLokei Yaakov. So what have we seen here? So Chazal understood that David HaMelech in this Tehillim 81 is telling us that when you blow the shofar on Rosh Chodesh, which is Rosh Hashanah, what you're actually celebrating is a day of judgment of leLokei Yaakov. The God of Yaakov is judging Klal Yisrael. So this is the clearest, if you like, remez. It's still a remez, but it's the clearest indication in the Tanakh connecting the day of Rosh Hashanah with the concept of judgment. Just as a footnote, I've included also the last line of this Mizmor, which I think some people are familiar with. If you're in shul on a Thursday morning, right? Sometimes people, the only thing you actually manage to hear is the last sentence, because the speed of davening has usually accelerated to such a degree that Hayom Yom Chamishi B'Shabbos usually ends up with Hayom Yom Chamishi B'Shabbos on the second Guinness Osov V'Yachileu Mechelev Chito U'Mitzur Devash Aspieka. This is the closing pasuk, which is said out loud, which he translates here correctly. He fed them from the finest wheat. Chelev Chito is the finest wheat. U'Mitzur, and from the rock, Devash Aspieka, I will give you honey. Right? Why is this interesting? Because this chapter is dealing with Rosh Hashanah and judgment. This is the origin of the minhag of dipping your challah in the honey. You see that, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen? You're dipping your challah in the honey because in the Mizmor 81, it says you should take the wheat, which is, of course, the bread, in the honey. Tzur devash aspieka. The chito and the dvash are together in this pasuk, and that for some reason, which is maybe a subject for a different shia, what is honey? Why is the apple in the honey and the challah in the honey? But dipping the challah in the honey is connected to this Mizmor Tehillim. Isn't that amazing? How a chapter in Tehillim contains within it so many different levels of meaning and so many different levels. The message is a multi-layered message to understand that when you blow the Schaefer, it's a time of mishpat. Right. So what I'd like to have a look at now is a very interesting, another issue of a bit more closely at this idea here, the idea of Hamelech HaKodesh. What are we really saying? I want to reflect on this because this is the most recurring theme in the whole of our davening. Not only in the third bracha of the Shemona Esrei, that's not Hakel HaKodesh, but it's Hamelech HaKodesh, but throughout all our davening, the Hamelech HaMishpat, during the weekday davening, and also, whereas normally on every Shabbos we say Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh HaShabbos, and on Yom Tov we say Baruch Atah Hashem Mekadesh Yisrael V'Azmanim. On Rosh Hashanah we say Baruch Atah Hashem Melech Al Kol HaOretz, Mekadesh Yisrael V'Yom HaZikaron. The Melech is the key phrase. And the word Melech needs a little bit of understanding for us. Maybe in earlier times, in the Middle Ages and earlier, where the idea of a king was a bit more intuitively understood by everybody, right? And the point of a king was that a king had, if you like, maybe I'll just mention this briefly. In order to appreciate fully what the word Melech means in our Tefillah, you have to understand what it meant for the people who wrote the text of our Tefillah. The idea of a king in the ancient world up until the Magna Carta, and maybe even beyond that, was that the king had absolute powers. He was not answerable to anybody. Life and death was in the hands of the king, and he didn't have to explain himself to anybody. The idea of the king was, when you met the king, everybody was shaking. Even his closest advisors and his closest family members were all shaking in their boots because the king had the absolute power of life and death for any individual in his country, right? And as we all know, were famous megalomaniac murderers like Henry VIII used that power extensively, right? It always amazes me how certain kings are seen as great heroes when actually, if you look closely at what they did in their life, they were really executing people left, right, and center. Henry VIII, they spoke about Henry. I remember in school learning about the dissolution of the monasteries. It always amazed me how English manages to find words like dissolution, which nobody quite understands what it means, when really it meant basically the mass massacre of all the Catholic priests and cathedrals and Catholics in the land of England were massacred completely massacred. And this was referred to as the dissolution of the monasteries, as if it just meant that he sort of made a small change in the laws about of opening times of the monasteries. In actual fact, they were completely mercilessly massacred, and only because he had family problems with the Pope. Because of that, he was willing to massacre hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, and that was the king. He was answerable to nobody, right? The Magna Carta was an attempt to rein in the powers of the king, but you can see hundreds of years later, still the king had absolute powers. Why am I mentioning all this? Because the word melech in our tefillah is meant to evoke in us this understanding that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that even today that we don't have any more a king with absolute powers. We've got a constitutional government with all sorts of checks and balances between the legislative and the executive. We don't anymore have a king with absolute powers, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu remains the Melech. The Melech is HaKadosh Baruch Hu retains that title throughout. And I want to show you something interesting in the Chumash. I'm following here an idea that I found in the writings of the Vilna Gaon and later in the writings of the Malbim, which I'd like to share with you just for a minute, which makes this idea a bit more understandable. And this is, let's for 2 minutes, let's take a excursion into a famous story in Parshas Vayeshev, Yosef and his brothers. Everybody with me? You'll see in a minute why we're looking at this. So it says, Vayachalom Yosef Chalom. Yosef has this dream, right? Vayaged le'echav, and he told his brothers, Vayosifa otznoosa. And as a result of these dreams, the brothers hated him, right? This is not a story that we are all particularly proud of, just by the way. It's a story of Yosef being too overt with his predictions of power, and the brothers allowing themselves to be overtaken by jealousies. Anyhow, so he said to them, let me tell you my dream, right? And what is the dream? We all know the famous dream of Yosef, that he's in the fields, right? We're binding sheaves, and my sheaf stood up, and all your sheaves gathered down and bowed low, right? So what was he saying to them? He was saying, you should know that I'm going to be the leader of this family going forward, and you're all going to be subservient to me. And of course, this dream was completely accurate. It turned out to be true, right? They all came and they bowed down to him. And the reason why the dream had sheaves of corn is because that was the context of them coming to bow down to him, was because they needed food. Anyhow, what's important for us today is not Parshas Vayeshev. What's important for us today is this pasuk. What do the brothers say to him? Do you intend to be king over us? And they continued to hate him even more because he talked about his dreams. What's interesting here is the appearance of the word hamoloch timloch. So the word melech here, the word king, is used here as a verb, right? To reign over us as a king, right? Im moshol timshol bonu. So what is the difference? And this is an interesting question the Malbim, the Vilna Gaon, and others deal with. What is the difference between the word melech and the word moshel? They both mean somebody who rules the nation, who rules the country. The difference between a melech and a moshel. So just I can see time is getting a bit short, so I'll cut this a little bit short. The bottom line here is that Hamonach Timloch Aleinu means, do you think we will ever give you our consent to rule over us? Because a melech is a king by consent of his citizens. The citizens want him to be king, and he rules by their consent, or in So the Moshel Tim Shalbana, or do you plan to rule over us without our consent? That's really how the Malbim learns this pasuk, and I think that's a brilliant pshat in this pasuk. The brothers were asking him, how do you think this is going to happen? Do you think we'll one day go crazy and appoint you as a king with consent, or do you plan to be a tyrant and rule over us without our consent? So what's interesting here is, from this pasuk we see, and from the Mefarshim here, says the Vilna Gaon, that the concept of melech is different from the word moshel, right? Moshel is somebody who rules de facto, whereas melech has ein melech below am. The people want this ruler to rule over them. So in actual fact, if you build this idea into our Rosh Hashanah davening, it gives us a new sense of depth to whatever we're saying. Because you could ask a question: why do we need to announce the power of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in ruling the world? That is a fact. That's a fact of existence, that we live in God's world, God the Creator, and He holds our lives in His hand. What we are doing on Rosh Hashanah is we are saying to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you are not a Moshel, you are a Melech. In other words, we are changing, in a sense, we're giving something to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You might think, what can we possibly give to God? What can we give Him? And the answer is, we can give Him something. We can give Him the fact that we wish to be judged by Him. We wish to be ruled by Him. We are calling Him a Melech. The Melech is giving Him our, because I saw a very nice paragraph here in Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So he says, our plea to Hashem is, on Rosh Hashanah, let your rule become evident. Hashem has reigned supreme at all times. It's only man who has failed to recognize and render. We now pray that man will at long last come to know Hashem's eternal, universal sovereignty and pay tribute of unreserved obedience. In other words, we're davening on HaKadosh Baruch, we're davening on Rosh Hashanah for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to be Melech al Kol Ha'olam. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should gain the consent of all of mankind to rule the world. And in that sense, we are renewing our acceptance of a divine sovereignty. And that's what Rosh Hashanah is about. As I mentioned last week, it's like an annual renewal of the lease. We get an annual renewal of a lease on life, Zachreinu L'chaim, and we annually renew our affirmation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not as the Moshe, but as the Melech. In fact, it's a very interesting pasuk we mentioned in our Tefillah once or twice. Right? Ki Lashem Hamlucha u'Moshel Bagoyim. Interesting word. If you think about that pasuk for a minute, Ki Lashem Hamlucha u'Moshel Bagoyim means that God rules equally the Jewish and the non-Jewish world. Right? There's no difference in terms of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's control of the world. What is different is that Lashem HaMelucha, we say Hashem Melech, Hashem Molech, Hashem Yimloch, but Umoshel Bagoyim, the nations of the world are equally ruled by Him, only they don't recognize it. So for the non-Jews, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is indeed a Moshel. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is running their world without their consent, without their recognition and acknowledgement, right? If they're not God-fearing non-Jews. If they're God-fearing non-Jews, then they also have a great chelek in recognizing Malchus Shamayim. But Rosh Hashanah is a time of renewing our understanding of Hashem Melech, Hashem Molech, meaning that we are giving, if you like, our consent to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be, that we wish to be judged. And in that sense, being judged by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and I'll just end with this idea, the idea with which I started. So I started with the idea from Nehemiah that Rosh Hashanah has this duality to it. It's also a day of seriousness and trepidation, mi yamod lefanecha badin, but it's also a day of simcha. Nehemiah tells them, no, ki kodesh Hashem la'adonav. Ki chedvas Hashem ima uzchem. What is this combination of ideas? So I think what you have to think about when you're davening Rosh Hashanah is that on the one hand, it's a Yom Hadin, and everything is at stake. Our health and our parnasa and our lives and the lives of our families, the lives of Klal Yisrael and of the nations, everything is at stake. Everything is being decided, and that's a time of trepidation, because in a sense, we know we don't deserve much from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? And we're asking for a mishpat barachamim, asking for Mechazdei Hashem, right? But on the other hand, and here's the interesting thing which we want to finish, being judged by HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a compliment. It's a compliment. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying, your actions are important to me. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't judge the horses and the dogs and the whales and the giraffes. He doesn't judge all or all living things. Living things simply live in a world of cause and effect, a world of nature. The idea of being accountable to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for our deeds is on the one hand frightening, but on the other hand, it's the highest possible compliment that HaKadosh Baruch Hu could give us. He's saying that every year on Rosh Hashanah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu renews his Malchus Shamayim, and he does that by judging the Jewish people. Meaning that every act of ours and every day and every thought and every activity of ours is important to him, and he wants to see us living the right sort of life, a life of Pi Torah of our mitzvahs. And therefore, that is the source of simcha. The simcha is that we're being judged, and the trepidation is that we are being judged. The fact that we're being judged generates both of these feelings equally. And that's Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, we're going to go through the davening of Rosh Hashanah and even the Schaefer itself, and we're going to see this it's a hybrid. Okay, so everybody thinks a hybrid is a type of car. So in our life, hybrid is indeed a type of car, but Rosh Hashanah is a hybrid day, a day of din and trepidation, and a day of the highest possible simcha and feeling of worth, feeling of value, feeling that we are significant in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is really the key to understanding our tefillos and understanding the importance of Rosh Hashanah. And I think that's it for today, Eli. I think that's it for you can unmute people if you like. And I'd like to wish you all a very good